Mental strength. Stop having a weak mind. Most people go through life reacting. Not choosing, not deciding, reacting. Something happens, a comment, a setback, a pressure, an inconvenience, and the response arrives automatically, without consultation, without deliberation, without the slightest intervention from the part of the mind that would produce a considered reply. The emotion fires, the behavior follows. The mouth opens, the decision is made, the action is taken, all of it driven by whatever the activated emotional state generated, before genuine thought had any involvement in the process. This is a weak mind, not a cruel judgment, a precise description. The weak mind is the one that runs on automatic, that is governed by its immediate reactions rather than by deliberate intention, that allows the conditions of any given moment to determine its behavior rather than applying its own judgment to choose the behavior the moment actually requires. The weak mind is not unintelligent, it is undisciplined, and the distinction between these two things is critical, because it means the condition is not fixed. Intelligence is largely a given, discipline is built. The weak mind that has not yet been trained is the raw material from which psychological strength is constructed through specific practices, applied consistently across the ordinary situations of ordinary days. This audiobook is that construction, not the announcement of the destination, the actual building, layer by layer, through 10 chapters that address the specific patterns, tendencies, and vulnerabilities of the undisciplined mind and replace them, one by one, with the capacities of the disciplined one. The word stop in the title is deliberate. Stop having a weak mind, not fix it, not overcome it. Stop it the way you stop any bad habit, by understanding exactly what it is doing and why, and replacing it with a deliberate alternative that, practiced consistently, becomes the new default. The weak mind reacts, the strong mind responds. The weak mind is governed by emotion, the strong mind uses emotion as information. The weak mind follows the path of least resistance. The strong mind chooses the path that serves it, regardless of whether it is the easiest one. The weak mind is shaped by its environment. The strong mind shapes its response to the environment. Every one of these distinctions is specific, learnable, and buildable. That is what this audiobook builds. Begin. Introduction. The mind you have versus the mind you build. There is a distinction that very few people clearly grasp: the difference between the mind you have by default and the mind you can build through deliberate effort. The default mind is the product of your history, the accumulated influence of every experience, every modeled behavior, every reinforced habit of thinking and responding that has been built over the course of your life. It is not randomly configured. It is shaped by real inputs, but those inputs were not chosen for their contribution to your psychological strength. They were the inputs of circumstance, what happened to be present in your environment, what responses were modeled by the people around you, what patterns were reinforced by the social environments you moved through. The default mind is therefore not necessarily well designed for the outcomes you want. It may contain exactly the patterns, tendencies, and vulnerabilities that are producing the results you are dissatisfied with. Its reactions may be the source of the conflicts, the missed opportunities, the sustained discomfort, and the pervasive sense of being at the mercy of circumstances rather than in genuine command of your own responses to them. The built mind is different. It is not an accident of history. It is the product of deliberate work of the specific understanding, the specific practices, and the specific consistent application of those practices across real situations that gradually replace the default patterns with chosen ones. It is the mind that you decided to have, constructed from the ground up through the discipline of genuinely examining how you think, identifying where the patterns are producing poor outcomes, and building alternative patterns that produce better ones. This audiobook is the construction manual for the built mind, not in theory and practice. Each chapter addresses a specific dimension of psychological discipline, maps its current default pattern version in the undisciplined mind, and builds the deliberate alternative that the disciplined one develops in its place. The mind you have is where the work begins. The mind you build is what the work produces. Chapter 1 starts with the most fundamental distinction between them. Chapter 1. Weak minds react. A weak mind reacts immediately. A strong mind thinks first. The reaction is the signature of the undisciplined mind, and understanding why it dominates most people's behavior is the first step toward replacing it with something more deliberate. A reaction is not a choice. It is an automatic output, the behavioral expression of whatever the emotional system generated in response to an incoming stimulus. The stimulus arrives at critical comment, an unexpected obstacle, a piece of information that contradicts what you expected, a situation that your established patterns have coded as threatening or frustrating. The emotional system processes the stimulus against its stored patterns, generates a response state, and drives behavior toward the output that response state specifies. All of this happens before the deliberate, reasoning part of the mind has been consulted. The reaction is already underway by the time awareness arrives. This is the mechanism of the weak mind, the automatic, pre-deliberate execution of emotionally driven behavioral outputs. It is not stupidity. It is the absence of the specific capacity that would insert deliberate processing between the stimulus and the response. That capacity is not automatically present. It is built through the training this audiobook describes. Why emotional reactions control most people is a question that requires honest examination. Because the control is often invisible to the person being controlled. The core reason emotional reactions dominate most people's behavior is that reactions are fast and deliberation is slow. The emotional system's output arrives in milliseconds. The deliberate reasoning system's assessment takes seconds at minimum, often much longer for genuinely complex situations. In the gap between these two timescales, the reaction has already begun executing. By the time the deliberate mind has any involvement, the words are already being said, the decision is already being made, the behavior is already in motion. The second reason is that reactions feel like choices. This is among the most significant misunderstandings about the nature of reactive behavior from the inside. It feels like you are choosing the reaction. The frustration that generates a sharp reply feels like the justified expression of a genuine grievance, freely chosen. The anxiety that drives avoidance feels like a reasonable assessment of a real risk, leading to a considered decision. The pride that escalates a conflict feels like the appropriate defense of a genuine position. The feeling of choosing is generated by the same emotional system that produced the reaction. It is the system's interpretation of its own output as deliberate rather than as automatic. The deliberate mind, arriving to find the reaction already in progress, does not recognize the process for what it was. It adopts the output as its own. It constructs the justification for what the reaction did, and the person proceeds with the false experience of having chosen what was actually executed automatically. The illusion of feeling right is the specific form of this false experience that has the most corrosive long-term consequences for the development of psychological discipline. When the emotional reaction produces a response, the sharp reply, the avoidant decision, the escalated conflict, the emotional system that produced it simultaneously generates the felt sense that the response was correct. Not just understandable or forgivable, correct, deserved, the appropriate response to a situation that warranted it. This felt correctness is a feature of the emotional system's operation. Strong emotional states come packaged with the subjective experience of being well-founded. The problem is that the felt correctness is calibrated to the emotional state, not to the objective characteristics of the situation. Fear makes threat look real regardless of whether the actual threat level warrants the fear response. Anger makes injustice look clear regardless of whether the actual situation is as one-sided as the anger registers it. The confidence that accompanies the emotional reaction is the confidence of the emotional system in its own pattern-matched output, and that confidence is systematically miscalibrated to the actual situation. The illusion of feeling right is what makes the reactive pattern self-perpetuating. If reactions felt wrong, if the person experiencing them had immediate access to the accurate knowledge that their response was driven by an activated emotional state rather than by genuine deliberate assessment, the reactions would be easier to interrupt. But they feel right. They feel necessary. They feel like exactly the appropriate response to a situation that warranted them. And feeling right, they are rarely examined, rarely questioned, and rarely replaced with anything more considered. Why disciplined thinking is rare is the direct consequence of the 2 points above. Reactions feel like choices and feel right, which means there is very little internally generated pressure to develop the more effortful, deliberate alternative. The cost of reactive behavior often lands later and at a distance from the reaction itself. The conversation went badly, but that seems like the other person's fault. The decision turned out wrong, but that seems like bad luck or circumstances. The pattern accumulates outcomes without the person recognizing the pattern as their own doing. Disciplined thinking requires a degree of honest self-observation that most environments never demand and never model. The person who has grown up in environments where reactions were the norm, where emotional expression was rewarded over deliberate response, where the gap between stimulus and behavior was never considered as a place where a choice could be made, this person has no default practice of disciplined thinking to draw on. They have never been shown that the gap exists or that it is where genuine power lies. This audiobook makes the gap visible, and once it is visible, the work of building the discipline to inhabit it can begin. The reaction is the default, the response is the achievement, and the difference between them the deliberate cultivation of the space between stimulus and behavior is the entire practice of psychological strength that this audiobook builds. Chapter 2: Emotional Discipline. Most people are governed by their emotions without ever realizing it. The governance is invisible because it does not announce itself. There is no moment when the emotional system steps forward and declares its authority. It simply operates continuously, interpreting incoming experience, generating internal states, and driving behavior toward the outputs those states specify, all before the deliberate mind has been involved, all in a way that feels to the person experiencing it like their own considered judgment and action. Emotional governance is not the same as having strong emotions. The person who feels deeply and richly may be among the least emotionally governed. If they have built the capacity to receive their emotional experience fully without being automatically directed by it. And the person whose emotional expression seems controlled on the surface may be among the most emotionally governed. If the surface control is a suppression strategy rather than a genuine regulatory capacity, if the emotion is still directing the behavior from below the visible level of management. Emotional discipline is the specific capacity that replaces governance with the developed ability to receive the emotional signal as information rather than as instruction. To feel the pull of the emotional state without automatically executing its behavioral output, and to bring the deliberate mind into the process between the feeling and the action. Emotional triggers in daily life are more pervasive than most people acknowledge when they think carefully about them. The obvious triggers: the direct criticism, the significant disappointment, the clear conflict, are easy to identify because the emotional activation they produce is strong enough to be immediately noticeable. But the subtle triggers: the ambiguous comment that the pattern matching system reads as dismissive, the small deviation from expectation that generates low-level frustration, the habitual social situation that reliably produces a specific low-grade anxiety. These shape behavior continuously without ever rising to the level of conscious recognition as triggers. The daily life of an emotionally undisciplined person contains many of these subtle triggers, and their cumulative effect on mood, perception, and behavior across a day or a week is significant. They lower the threshold for visible reactive behavior. They produce a steady background noise of mild emotional activation that distorts perception in the specific ways described in Chapter 1. And they consume regulatory resource, the finite psychological capacity for emotional management, so that when genuinely significant triggers arrive, there is less available capacity to manage them. The first practice of emotional discipline is trigger mapping: the honest, specific identification of what types of situations, comments, or conditions reliably activate particular emotional states. Not the dramatic triggers everyone knows about, but the subtle daily ones that operate below the level of habitual attention. This mapping is done through observation, watching your own internal state across ordinary days, noting the moments when emotional activation arrives and what preceded it, building an increasingly precise catalog of the specific inputs that produce the specific outputs in your particular emotional system. How emotions distort perception is the mechanism that makes emotional governance so consequential. It is not only that emotions drive behavior, but that they change what is seen, making the distorted view feel like accurate perception. The distortion operates through the specific attentional biases that each emotional state produces. An activated frustration state directs attention toward the obstacles, the resistance, the evidence that things are not going as they should, and away from the progress, the available alternatives, and the longer view in which the current frustration might look significantly less significant. An activated anxiety state directs attention toward the threatening, the potentially dangerous, the worst-case scenarios, and away from the stabilizing, the manageable, the evidence that the catastrophe being anticipated is not as probable as the anxiety is registering it. Each emotional state is, in this sense, a selective filter on incoming reality. It does not create information that is not there. The obstacles the frustrated person sees are real obstacles. The risks the anxious person identifies are real risks. What the filter does is make some information more vivid and some information less accessible. In the specific direction the emotional state points, the result is a perception that is technically based on real features of the situation, but that is not an accurate, balanced representation of the full situation. The person who makes decisions from inside a strongly activated emotional state is making those decisions from inside a distorted perception. They are calibrating their choices to a version of the situation that the emotional filter has constructed rather than to the situation as it actually is. And because the distorted perception feels accurate because there is nothing internally available to distinguish the emotion-filtered view from the clear view, the person has no direct access to the knowledge that their perception is distorted. The knowledge comes from the practice of emotional awareness, which creates an indirect access to this information through the habit of recognizing the emotional state itself before acting from it. Training emotional awareness is the third dimension of this chapter, and it is the foundational practice on which all other emotional discipline rests. You cannot govern what you cannot see. The emotional system that operates below the threshold of conscious awareness that produces states and drives behavior before awareness is engaged can only be brought under deliberate governance when the awareness practice is developed enough to catch the activation early. The training has three progressive stages. The first is post-recognition noticing. After a reaction has occurred, that an emotional state was active and was directing the behavior. This stage produces no immediate behavioral change, but it builds the habit of looking back at responses and identifying the emotional mechanism that produced them. The looking back is the beginning of the self-observation capacity that the later stages require. The second stage is concurrent recognition noticing, while an emotional state is active, that it is active and that it is influencing perception and behavior. This stage begins to produce behavioral change because the recognition, while imperfect and often arriving after the behavior has already begun, provides at least some opportunity for the deliberate mind to participate. The emotion is named. This is frustration. This is anxiety, and the naming alone creates a minimal gap between the state and the automatic execution of its behavioral output. The third stage is anticipatory recognition, noticing the early signals of an emotional state before it has reached its peak, which creates the full space for deliberate response rather than automatic reaction. This stage is the product of consistent practice at the earlier stages. The early signals, the subtle physical precursors of each specific emotional state. The characteristic shifts in internal experience that precede the full activation become recognizable through the accumulated observation of how the specific emotional states develop and the specific person building this awareness. Emotional awareness built to this stage is the foundation of the disciplined emotional life. Not the prevention of emotional experience. The emotions are real and their informational content is valuable. The consistent, early recognition of what is active, before it has fully directed perception and behavior that allows genuine deliberate participation in what happens next. Chapter 3. Training the Brain. A strong mind does not appear by accident. It is trained. This is the foundational reframe that separates the psychology of psychological strength from the psychology of fixed personality. The assumption that some people are simply stronger-minded than others, that the quality is distributed by nature as a permanent characteristic, is both empirically wrong and practically disabling. It is wrong because the evidence from the study of how the brain changes under different conditions of use is clear. The brain is a plastic organ, continuously shaped by what it is asked to do, and the patterns it runs can be changed through deliberate, consistent practice. It is disabling because it removes the possibility of change before any attempt at change has been made. The accurate understanding replaces the fixed characteristic model with the trained capacity model. Psychological strength is a trained capacity, built through specific practices applied consistently across time, that changes the actual functional organization of the brain in ways that produce the disciplined thinking, the emotional regulation, and the behavioral consistency that characterize the strong mind. Neuroplasticity and habits are the scientific and behavioral dimensions of the same underlying reality. Neuroplasticity is the brain's capacity to reorganize its functional architecture in response to patterns of use, to strengthen the neural pathways that are consistently used and to weaken those that are not. Habits are the behavioral expression of this process, the patterns of thinking and behavior that, through consistent repetition, become automatic, requiring less deliberate resource, running more fluidly, and gradually becoming the default rather than the exceptional. The connection between neuroplasticity and habit formation is direct and specific. Every time a particular pattern of thinking or behavior is executed, the neural substrate of that pattern is slightly strengthened. The strengthening is small in any single instance. It is significant across hundreds and thousands of instances. The pattern that was initially effortful and deliberate becomes, through consistent repetition, automatic. The pattern that was once the exception becomes, through consistent repetition, the default. This is as true for the patterns of deliberate, disciplined thinking as it is for any other cognitive pattern. The habit of pausing before reacting, initially effortful, requiring deliberate initiation and deliberate maintenance, becomes, through consistent practice, more automatic. The neural pathway that supports the pause becomes better established. The delay that initially required significant deliberate effort begins to run with less. The disciplined response begins to arrive more naturally in situations that previously produced automatic reactions. Mental training, like physical training, is the most useful analogy for understanding both the process and the timeline of psychological discipline development, and also for managing the expectations that determine whether the training continues long enough to produce the results it builds toward. Physical training produces no visible results in a single session. It produces no meaningful results in a week. It produces the first recognizable results over a period of weeks, and the significant results over months. This is not a failure of the training, it is the timeline of the biological process of adaptation. The body is changing in response to the training, but the changes accumulate below the visible threshold for a significant period before they become apparent. Psychological training follows the same timeline. The first applications of the pause practice, the early attempts at emotional awareness, the initial efforts to replace automatic reactions with deliberate responses, these produce no immediate dramatic change. The reactions still happen, the emotional states still arrive. the patterns are still largely intact. This is the expected early period of any skill development, the period in which the habit is being built below the visible threshold, and in which the most common error is the conclusion that the training is not working. The conclusion that the training is not working is wrong at this stage. What is happening is exactly what should be happening: the early, low visible result phase of a genuine capacity development. The person who continues through this phase, who maintains the practice despite the absence of obvious immediate results, is building what becomes visible in the weeks and months that follow. The person who concludes the training is not working and stops is abandoning the investment at exactly the point before it begins to return. Repeating discipline thinking is the specific behavioral requirement of the mental training model, and it is where the analogy with physical training is most directly useful. A physical training program works because the specific movements are repeated often enough, in the right conditions, to produce the specific biological adaptations that the movements are designed to build. Doing the movement once produces nothing significant. Doing it 100 times begins to build the adaptation. Doing it 1,000 times, consistently, builds the capacity to the level where it is reliably available under real conditions. Disciplined thinking works identically. The pause between stimulus and response, repeated consistently across ordinary daily interactions, is what builds the neural pathway that makes the pause more automatic in more demanding situations. The emotional awareness practice applied consistently to the mild emotional activations of ordinary daily life is what builds the recognition capacity that catches stronger activations earlier. The habit of examining the first automatic interpretation before accepting it, practiced in low-stakes situations consistently, is what builds the evaluation habit that operates in high-stakes situations. The training must be consistent, not perfect. Perfection is not the standard and is not achievable. Consistent, the practice is applied on more days than they are not, in more situations than they are missed, with enough regularity that the repetition is genuinely building something rather than producing isolated instances of disciplined behavior surrounded by the same default patterns. Consistency is not willpower, it is design. The training that is designed into the structure of ordinary daily life, that happens because the conditions for it have been established rather than because the motivation for it must be regenerated each time, is the training that is actually consistent. Design the practice, build the repetition. The mind changes. Chapter 4. Breaking weak mental patterns. Mental weakness is not character, it is habit. This reframe is among the most practically significant in this entire audiobook, because it recoats the problem from the unchangeable to the addressable. Character, in the popular conception of a fixed constellation of permanent traits, does not change through effort. Habit changes through specific, sustained behavioral practice. If mental weakness is character, the most honest advice is acceptance. If mental weakness is habit, the most honest advice is training. The evidence strongly supports the habit interpretation. The patterns that constitute what people call mental weakness are not expressed uniformly across all contexts. They are context-dependent, situation-sensitive, and responsive to environmental design in ways that fixed characteristics are not. The person who is reactive in one type of situation is often composed in others. The person who catastrophizes about professional setbacks may be completely steady in personal difficulties. The person whose thinking collapses under social pressure maintains excellent judgment in solitary decision-making. This variability is not characteristic of fixed character traits. It is characteristic of habits and patterns that are associated with specific context cues. Automatic reactions are the most visible form of the weak mental pattern, the reflexive behavioral outputs that are produced without deliberate initiation in response to the specific triggers they have been associated with through repeated activation. The automatic reaction is not chosen each time it occurs. It is triggered. The context activates the pattern. The pattern runs. The behavioral output appears, and the deliberate mind arrives to find the reaction already underway. The reaction feels chosen because it feels right, as discussed in Chapter 1, but the feeling of choice is post hoc. The actual mechanism was automatic pattern execution. Breaking automatic reactions requires a three-phase approach. The first phase is recognition, building the awareness practice described in Chapter 2 to the level at which the specific automatic reactions can be identified as pattern-specific triggers, reliably producing specific responses through a mechanism that bypasses deliberate processing. The recognition phase produces no immediate behavioral change. It produces the accurate map of the terrain that the subsequent phases require. The second phase is interruption, the deliberate, consistent practice of inserting a pause between the trigger and the execution of the automatic reaction whenever the trigger is recognized. The interruption does not need to change the response immediately. It only needs to insert time, the interval in which the deliberate mind can potentially participate. Even when the reaction proceeds largely as before, the insertion of the pause is building the habit of the pause, which is the prerequisite for the third phase. The third phase is replacement, the deliberate choice, in the pause, of a response that differs from the automatic one. This replacement is not suppression. The automatic impulse is acknowledged rather than denied. It is redirection. The impulse is registered. The deliberate question is asked, what does this situation actually require? And the chosen response is produced from the answer to that question rather than from the automatic pattern. Thought loops are the cognitive dimension of weak mental patterns, the recurring sequences of thinking that arrive automatically in specific situations, that cycle without genuine progress toward resolution, and that generate sustained emotional activation without producing anything useful. A thought loop is not deliberate thinking. Deliberate thinking moves. It starts with a question, gathers information, evaluates it, and arrives at a conclusion or a next step. A thought loop stays. It returns repeatedly to the same starting point, generates the same concerns, rehearses the same fears or grievances or anxieties, and produces the same emotional activation without any of this cycling producing new information, better assessment, or progress toward resolution. Thought loops sustain and amplify emotional activation. They are the cognitive mechanism through which an emotional state that would naturally diminish is continuously restimulated. The worry about a future outcome, returned to repeatedly without resolution, is continuously restimulating the anxiety that the worry generates. The rehearsal of a grievance, cycled repeatedly without resolution, is continuously restimulating the anger that the grievance generated initially. The loop is a machine for maintaining the activated state. Breaking thought loops requires the recognition that the cycling is occurring, followed by the deliberate intervention of a specific question: is there anything I can do about this right now? If yes, the answer to that question directs the thinking toward action rather than cycling toward a specific next step rather than another rotation of the concern. If no, if the thing being looped about is genuinely outside the current domain of action, the recognition of this fact provides the basis for the deliberate decision to stop the loop rather than continuing to generate emotional activation around something that no amount of cycling will resolve. Replacing destructive thinking is the broader category that includes both automatic reactions and thought loops, the full range of habitual thinking patterns that produce poor outcomes and that, because they are habitual, perpetuate themselves without examination. The replacement is not the pasting of positive thinking over negative content. It is the deliberate cultivation of more accurate and more useful thinking patterns that address the same situations that the destructive patterns have been handling. The catastrophizing that amplifies threat beyond what the evidence supports is replaced not by the dismissal of genuine risk, but by the accurate, proportionate assessment of actual risk level. The personalization that attributes events primarily to yourself is replaced not by the denial of your own role, but by the accurate assessment of all the factors that contributed. Each destructive pattern has a specific accurate alternative. The alternative is not simply the positive version of the pattern. It is the correct version, the version that accurately represents the situation and produces thinking that is actually useful for navigating it. Find the patterns, name them precisely. Build the accurate alternative. Practice the replacement until the alternative begins to arrive before the destructive version has run its full course. That is how weak mental patterns become strong ones. Chapter 5. Resisting social pressure. The greatest weakness of the undisciplined mind is the need to be liked by everyone. This need operates as a specific vulnerability in the psychological architecture, one that is exploitable by anyone who understands it and that compromises the quality of thinking, decision-making, and behavior in ways that are often invisible to the person experiencing them. The need for universal approval is not a character flaw. It is the expression of a deeply embedded social motivation, the desire to be accepted, included, and positively regarded by the people around you. This motivation is universal in the human species, and it serves genuine functions in social cohesion and cooperative behavior. The problem arises when it becomes so dominant that it overrides the exercise of genuine independent judgment, when the desire for approval becomes the primary input to decisions that should be made on the basis of honest assessment rather than on the basis of what will be most socially received. Fear of judgment is the specific experience through which the need for approval asserts its pressure. And it is worth mapping precisely because it operates through mechanisms that are often not recognized as the approval-seeking they actually are. The fear of judgment produces a specific cognitive distortion. It makes the assessment of others' likely reactions to your behavior more prominent than the assessment of the quality of the behavior itself. When making a decision, the person whose thinking is dominated by fear of judgment is not primarily asking what the right decision is. They are primarily modeling how each option will be received. What will people think? Will this invite criticism? Will this position me as someone who does not conform to the expected standard? These questions are not irrelevant. The social consequences of decisions are real and worth considering. But when they dominate the decision process, the quality of the decision is being determined by social modeling rather than by honest assessment. The fear of judgment also produces the specific inhibition of genuine expression, the systematic modification of what you say, what positions you take, and what you are willing to do, in the direction of what will be most generally approved. This modification is not deliberate censorship in most cases. It is the automatic, preverbal editing that the fear of disapproval performs on every outgoing communication before it reaches expression. The thought forms, the approval-seeking filter applies, the thought is modified or suppressed, and the modified version is what appears, all in a process that is so rapid and so habitual that the person often does not notice that they expressed a modified version of what they actually think. Conformity psychology is the broader social mechanism through which the fear of judgment operates at the group level, the specific ways that social environments produce pressure toward alignment with the group's norms, standards, and expressed views. Groups exert conformity pressure through multiple simultaneous mechanisms. The informational mechanism operates by using others' expressed views as evidence about what is true, treating the fact that many people believe something as evidence that it is correct, regardless of the independent quality of the belief. The normative mechanism operates through the social costs of visible nonconformity, the mild but real discomfort of being the person whose view diverges from the group's, the social friction of holding a different position, the implicit message that the deviant view is unwelcome. These mechanisms produce their effects below the level of deliberate awareness in most cases. The person who shifts their expressed view in the direction of the group consensus rarely recognizes this shift as conformity pressure. They experience it as updating their view in response to the evidence of others' thinking, as reasonable openness to persuasion rather than as capitulation to social pressure. The distinction between these two things is genuine and important. Genuine persuasion involves the actual evaluation of the quality of others' reasoning and the revision of your view based on that reasoning. Conformity involves the revision of your expressed view based on the social cost of maintaining the divergent position, regardless of the quality of the reasoning behind it. Independent thinking is the cognitive capacity that resists conformity pressure without becoming contrarianism, the ability to evaluate the quality of an argument rather than the social acceptability of the conclusion it produces, and to maintain a position when the evidence supports it even when the social environment does not. The practice of independent thinking begins with the habit of pre-commitment, forming your own view on a matter before you are exposed to the social pressure of others' expressed views on it. When you know your own position before you enter the social context in which that position will be compared to others, you have a reference point against which to measure any subsequent shift. Was my view changed because I encountered better reasoning? Or was it changed because the social pressure made the original position uncomfortable to hold? This distinction requires genuine honesty, because the rationalization of conformity as genuine persuasion is automatic and convincing. The mind that has shifted a view under social pressure will typically construct a narrative in which the shift was the product of open-minded engagement with the better argument. Recognizing this as rationalization requires the specific internal question: what is the actual quality of the reasoning that changed my view, independent of its social reception? Resisting social pressure is not the same as refusing all social input. Others' perspectives are genuinely valuable sources of information and corrective to the blind spots of individual judgment. The disciplined thinker takes others' views seriously on the merits. They do not take them seriously because they were expressed with social force. or because holding a divergent view produces social discomfort, or because the approval of the group is more important to them than the accuracy of their own thinking. Build the honest position first, then let the social environment engage with it. That ordering is the foundation of intellectual independence. Chapter 6. Thinking independently. A strong mind does not follow the crowd. It forms its own conclusions. Chapter 5 mapped the social pressure mechanisms that compromise independent thinking. This chapter builds the cognitive architecture that produces the specific mental habits and disciplines that make genuine independent reasoning available, not as an occasional achievement but as a consistent mode of operation. Independent reasoning is not the same as contrarianism. The contrarian takes positions against the consensus automatically, as a reflexive assertion of independence that is itself a form of social determination defined entirely by what others think. Just in the opposing direction, the independent thinker evaluates the quality of the reasoning behind any position, regardless of its popularity, and forms their own view on that basis. Sometimes this produces agreement with the consensus. Sometimes it produces disagreement. The criterion is the quality of the thinking, not the direction of the conclusion relative to what others believe. Independent reasoning is built on a specific set of cognitive practices that together produce the capacity to evaluate arguments on their merits. The first practice is source separation, the deliberate distinction between the claim and the authority making it. The claim deserves evaluation on its logical merits and evidential support. The authority making it may be relevant context but should not be the primary determinant of the claim's acceptability. The strong mind asks, is this argument well-reasoned and well-evidenced? It does not ask, do I respect the person making it? The second practice is assumption identification, the deliberate mapping of the unstated premises that an argument requires to reach its stated conclusion. Every argument rests on assumptions. Many of those assumptions are not stated because stating them would invite their examination, and some of them would not survive examination. The disciplined reasoner does not accept the conclusion until they have identified the assumptions it rests on and evaluated whether those assumptions are actually warranted. The third practice is stillman rather than strawman when engaging with a position you are inclined to disagree with. Deliberately constructing the strongest possible version of that position rather than the weakest. The strawman argument, the attack on a weakened version of the opposing view, is easy to win and produces nothing. The stillman engagement, the honest grappling with the strongest version of the opposing reasoning, is genuinely challenging and produces either a more solid basis for disagreement or the genuine recognition that the position has more merit than the initial inclination to dismiss it suggested. Avoiding groupthink is the application of independent reasoning practices to the specific challenge of maintaining intellectual autonomy in group settings where the conformity mechanisms described in Chapter 5 operate most strongly and where the deformation of individual judgment by group dynamics is most common. Groupthink is not the product of unintelligent groups. It is the product of groups in which the social dynamics of cohesion and harmony have been allowed to override the cognitive practices of honest disagreement and genuine evaluation. Highly intelligent, capable people in cohesive groups produce groupthink with impressive efficiency. The very intellectual capability of the group members is directed toward the construction of elaborate justifications for the consensus position rather than toward the genuine examination of its weaknesses. The specific behavioral discipline that prevents groupthink is the willingness to express genuine disagreement when you hold it not as social challenge, not as performance of independence, but as the honest contribution of a perspective that the group process needs and that no one else has offered. This willingness requires both the intellectual independence to have formed a genuine view and the psychological security to express it in the face of the social pressure toward consensus. Confidence in your perspective is what makes the expression of genuine disagreement socially possible, not the arrogant certainty that you are right, but the grounded security that your perspective has been honestly formed and deserves to be heard even if the group does not immediately receive it well. This confidence is not an attitude you decide to have. It is the product of the specific practices of independent reasoning described in this chapter. The person who has formed their view through the careful evaluation of evidence, through the honest examination of their own assumptions, through the genuine engagement with the strongest versions of opposing arguments, this person has a legitimate basis for the confidence that their perspective deserves expression. Not infallibility, legitimate process. Confidence built on legitimate process is qualitatively different from confidence built on the social performance of certainty. It is less loud and more durable. It does not require the validation of others to maintain itself, because it is grounded in the process that produced it rather than in the reactions it receives. And it is more open to genuine revision, because it is not the defense of a social identity, but the expression of a considered judgment, and considered judgments can be updated when better reasoning or better evidence arrives. The strong mind does not follow the crowd because it does not need to. It has developed its own process for evaluating questions and forming views. That process is rigorous enough to produce confidence in its outputs, and honest enough to update them when the evidence warrants. The crowd follows its own process: social approval, conformity pressure, the informational influence of others' expressed views. The independent thinker follows a different one. The difference in the quality of conclusions they produce compounds over time in every domain where the quality of thinking determines the quality of outcomes. Chapter 7. Enduring discomfort. Weak minds avoid discomfort, strong minds use it. This is one of the most practically important distinctions in this audiobook, because discomfort avoidance is the mechanism that keeps most people in the conditions they want to change. The pattern is specific and ubiquitous. There is something in the person's life that is not working, a situation, a capability, a behavioral pattern, and the conditions required to change it involve discomfort. The difficult conversation that would resolve the chronic tension, the sustained practice that would build the missing capability, the deliberate engagement with the challenging situation that would develop the tolerance for it, the honest examination of the pattern that would make it visible and therefore changeable. Each of these requires entering a zone of discomfort, and the discomfort avoidance drive, which operates automatically and powerfully in most people, produces the systematic selection of the more comfortable alternative, the avoidance of the difficult conversation, the postponement of the practice, the distraction from the challenging engagement, the failure to examine the pattern honestly, The avoidance produces temporary relief from the discomfort. It leaves the condition that required the discomfort unchanged. The same situation, the same missing capability, the same behavioral pattern all intact, all ready to produce the same discomfort the next time they are encountered. Growth through discomfort is not a motivational slogan. It is the description of the actual mechanism through which capabilities develop and patterns change. Every capability develops through the repeated engagement with conditions that challenge it, conditions that are currently beyond the comfortable range of performance, that require effort and produce the strain of extension beyond the current limit. This is the progressive overload principle from physical training. Applied to psychological capacity, the system develops by being required to perform at the edge of its current capability. It does not develop through the repetition of what it can already do comfortably. The discomfort is the signal that development is occurring, not the guarantee of development. Overload without recovery, challenge without competence building, produces damage rather than growth. But within the right range of challenge, the range that is genuinely demanding without being overwhelming, the discomfort of extension is the experience of the developing edge of a capability. Most people, confronting this discomfort, have learned to read it as a stop signal rather than as a proceed signal. The discomfort says this is hard, and the automatic response is to move away from what is hard. The psychological strength training this chapter is building says this is hard, which means this is where the development is. The deliberate choice to stay in the difficult zone rather than exiting it is the specific behavioral practice that produces the growth. Emotional resilience is the specific capacity that develops through the consistent engagement with emotional discomfort, the ability to experience strong, difficult emotional states without being overwhelmed by them, without executing the avoidance behaviors they drive, and without the extended residence in the activated state that emotional avoidance maintains. Emotional resilience is not emotional toughness in the sense of not feeling. It is not the capacity to be unmoved by genuinely moving things, or to be unsettled by genuinely unsettling ones. It is the capacity to feel the full range of emotional experience while maintaining the functional access to deliberate thinking and deliberate choice that the undisciplined emotional state compromises. To be in the difficult emotional state and still be capable of effective action. To experience the discomfort and not be prevented by it from doing what the situation requires. This capacity is built the same way all capacities are built, through the repeated, deliberate engagement with the conditions that challenge it. Emotional resilience is built by choosing to stay in emotionally uncomfortable situations rather than exiting them, and by practicing the maintenance of functional access to deliberate thinking while the emotional discomfort is present. The training is progressive, beginning with mild emotional discomforts that are within manageable range, building the tolerance and the functional maintenance practices at each level before extending to more challenging ones. The person who has practiced remaining in mild emotional discomfort while maintaining deliberate functioning has built the foundational capacity that extends, with continued practice, to more intense emotional challenges. Training tolerance is the specific dimension of discomfort endurance that addresses the general capacity to sustain the experience of difficulty, physical, cognitive, or emotional, without the reflexive exit that avoidance produces. Tolerance training is the deliberate practice of remaining in uncomfortable conditions for longer than is necessary, not for masochistic reasons, for the specific purpose of building the capacity to remain in conditions that are difficult, which is the prerequisite for doing anything that requires endurance of difficulty. The person whose tolerance limit is very low exits the difficult zone before anything in it can be accomplished. The person whose tolerance limit has been extended through training has the endurance available for the sustained engagement that produces the results the difficult zone contains. Start with the small discomforts of ordinary life. The physical discomfort of completing a task when the body would prefer to rest. The social discomfort of maintaining a position when the environment is pressuring you to release it. The cognitive discomfort of staying with a difficult problem rather than moving to something easier. The emotional discomfort of having a necessary conversation rather than deferring it again. Each of these is a tolerance training opportunity. Each time you choose to stay rather than to exit, you are building the capacity that the larger challenges will eventually require. And the accumulated building, over months of consistent practice, produces a qualitatively different relationship with difficulty, not the elimination of discomfort, but the expansion of what you can move through without being stopped by it. Chapter 8. Psychological Armor. If your mind is unprotected, anyone can run it. The unprotected mind is the mind that has no established internal boundaries, no consistent principles about what it will and will not be moved by. No practiced resistance to the social and psychological pressures that would direct it toward specific conclusions and behaviors. No reliable separation between the inputs arriving from the external environment and the internal processing that should govern the response to those inputs. The unprotected mind does not experience itself as unprotected. It experiences the external pressures as its own reactions, the manipulated conclusions as its own judgments, the directed behaviors as its own choices. The absence of protection is invisible from inside it because the protection it lacks would be the thing that made the external direction visible. Without the boundary, the external input and the internal process are not distinguished. The external input becomes the internal process. Mental boundaries are not walls, they are filters specific. Practice discriminations between the information and pressure arriving from external sources and the internal processing that evaluates and responds to that information. The person with healthy mental boundaries receives external input fully, engages with it genuinely, and responds from their own evaluated judgment. The external input informs the internal process. It does not replace it. Building mental boundaries requires 3 specific practices. The first is the consistent application of the question of source when a belief, a conclusion, or a behavioral impulse arrives, asking where it came from. Is this something I have formed through my own honest evaluation? Or is it something I have absorbed from the social environment without subjecting it to genuine examination? The regular application of this question creates the habit of distinguishing between the two, a habit that the unprotected mind has never developed because the question has never been asked. The second practice is the establishment of evaluated positions on questions that matter to you, positions formed through the deliberate reasoning described in Chapter 6 rather than through the absorption of others' views. Having an evaluated position on something that is relevant to your values and your decisions provides a reference point from which incoming pressure can be assessed. When the environment exerts pressure toward a different position, you have the basis for asking, is the pressure engaging with my reasoning? Or is it simply applying force toward a different conclusion? The first is legitimate persuasion. The second is pressure to be resisted. The third practice is the consistent application of the emotional discipline from Chapter 2 to attempts at manipulation. Manipulation typically operates through the emotional system through guilt, urgency, flattery, or social pressure, and its effectiveness depends on the target experiencing the generated emotional state as their own organic response rather than as the product of an external influence attempt. The emotional awareness practice the consistent habit of noticing what emotional state is active and what produced it makes the external origin of manipulated states visible, which is the first step toward not being determined by them. Emotional resilience, as it applies to psychological armor, is the specific capacity to maintain functional stability when the external environment is designed to destabilize you through criticism, through provocation, through the social pressure of others' disapproval, through the various forms of pressure that people and environments apply to bring individuals into line with their preferences. Destabilization attempts work by finding the specific sensitivities that produce disproportionate reactions when engaged the specific areas of the self-concept, the specific fears or desires, the specific emotional vulnerabilities that generate the strongest automatic responses. The person who has identified their own specific sensitivities and built the deliberate awareness practice around them has partially armored those sensitivities against exploitation. The awareness creates the gap between the activation of the sensitivity and the automatic execution of the reaction, which is the window in which the deliberate mind can assess whether the response the sensitivity is generating actually serves the situation. Emotional resilience in this context is not the hardening of the self against all external impact. It is the development of the stable internal foundation that allows significant external inputs, criticism, challenge, provocation, pressure to be received without destabilizing the fundamental orientation. The criticism can be heard and evaluated without the evaluation depending on it being positive for the internal stability to be maintained. The challenge can be engaged honestly without the outcome determining the sense of self. The provocation can be received and not executed. Detachment from manipulation is the specific form of psychological armor that addresses the deliberate or habitual attempts of others to direct your thinking and behavior through means that bypass honest engagement through emotional leverage rather than through the quality of reasoning and evidence. Detachment in this sense does not mean indifference to others or to social relationships. It means the specific refusal to allow the emotional states that manipulation generates in you to determine your behavior. The guilt that the guilt trip generates is real, you feel it. Detachment means evaluating whether the guilt reflects a genuine violation of your own values before acting from it. Rather than acting from it automatically, the urgency that the urgency trap generates is real, you feel it. Detachment means asking whether the urgency reflects actual time constraints before allowing it to compress deliberation. The psychological armor built through these practices does not produce an invulnerable person. It produces a person whose responses are consistently determined by their own evaluated judgment rather than by external manipulation of their emotional system. The armor is the governance capacity itself, the trained, practiced, consistent ability to be the primary author of your own responses, regardless of what the external environment is doing to try to author them for you. Chapter 9. The Calm Mindset. Calmness is the indicator of a strong mind. This statement requires examination because calm is frequently misunderstood as a temperamental disposition, as something certain people are born with and others are not, rather than as what it actually is: a practiced cognitive and physiological state that is the product of specific, buildable capacities. The person who appears calm under pressure is not necessarily less affected by the pressure than those who appear agitated. They may feel the pressure equally. What they have developed is the regulatory capacity to receive the activation that pressure produces without allowing it to immediately reorganize their cognitive state and behavioral output. The calmness is not the absence of internal response. It is the presence of the governing layer that intercepts the automatic expression of that response and produces a regulated state in its place. Why is calmness the indicator of a strong mind? Because the strong mind, as defined throughout this audiobook, is the disciplined mind, the one that has built the specific capacities that keep the deliberate reasoning process available under conditions that activate the automatic reactive mode. Calmness is the visible expression of these capacities operating. The person who remains genuinely calm when the environment is producing strong pressure signals has built the pause, the emotional awareness, the tolerance for discomfort, the psychological armor, and the independent judgment that together constitute the strong mind. The calmness is the output. The built capacities are what produce it. Calm perception is what the regulated, non-reactive state produces: the ability to see the situation as it actually is rather than through the amplifying and distorting lens of an activated emotional state. The perception available from a calm state is qualitatively different from the perception available from an agitated or reactive state. From the calm state, the full range of relevant information is accessible: the threatening elements and the reassuring ones, the problems and the available responses to them, the immediate challenge and the broader context in which it exists. From the activated state, the perception is organized around the activation itself, making the threat more vivid, the resources less apparent, the immediate problem more total, and the broader perspective less available. The practical consequence of this difference is that the decisions made from a calm perceptual state are systematically better calibrated to the actual situation than the decisions made from an activated one. Not because the calm person is more intelligent or more experienced, because they are working from a more accurate representation of the situation they are navigating. Building the access to calm perception in situations that produce pressure activation requires the full suite of practices described in the preceding chapters: the pause, the emotional awareness, the tolerance for discomfort that allows the activated state to be endured rather than immediately acted from. These practices together create the conditions in which the calm perceptual state can be maintained or recovered, even when the external environment is producing strong activation pressure. Emotional neutrality is the specific cognitive orientation that supports calm perception, the practice of receiving emotional experience as information about the situation rather than as instruction about how to respond to it. Emotional neutrality is not emotional flatness. The neutral observer is not indifferent. They are fully present to the emotional content of the situation, feeling what is genuinely there to be felt. What is neutral is not the emotional experience, but the relationship between the emotional experience and the cognitive processing of this situation. The emotion informs the processing without determining it. The fear registers as information about something in the situation that deserves careful attention. The frustration registers as information about something in the situation that is not as it should be. Neither generates the automatic behavioral output that the undisciplined state produces. The specific practice of emotional neutrality is the mental labeling habit when an emotional state is active, naming it specifically and explicitly before taking any action based on it. Not as a ritual as the precise act of making the emotional state visible to the deliberate mind rather than allowing it to operate invisibly as the primary organizer of perception and response. The naming creates a minimal but real separation between the state and the automatic expression of it, which is the beginning of the governed response. Strategic thinking is what becomes available when the calm mindset has been established, when the emotional noise that crowds out deliberate processing has been reduced enough for the reasoning capacity to operate at its actual level rather than at the impaired level that activation produces. The strategic thinker in a pressure situation is not thinking differently from anyone else in any fundamental sense. They are thinking more because more of their cognitive capacity is available. The pressure that has consumed the reactive person's deliberate processing resource has not consumed the same resource in the calm thinker. The attention that the reactive person is directing toward managing the distress of the activated state is available to the calm thinker for the actual assessment of this situation. The working memory that the reactive person is using to maintain the activated state is available to the calm thinker for the multivariable evaluation that complex situations require. The calm mindset is not a thinking style. It is the cognitive condition under which the actual quality of thinking becomes accessible. The strong mind is often not more intelligent than the reactive one. It simply has more of its intelligence available for use at the moments that most require it. Cultivate the calm as the baseline, not as the response to pressure, as the established state from which pressure is received. The person who is already calm when the pressure arrives has the full resource available. The person who is already in a background state of mild activation when the pressure arrives meets it from a compromised starting position. The calm mindset is built in the quiet moments, so it is available in the loud ones. Chapter 10. Becoming mentally unbreakable. When the mind becomes strong, life stops breaking it. The statement warrants careful examination because it can be misread as the promise of an invulnerable life, one in which difficulty no longer produces difficulty, in which setbacks no longer require genuine navigation, in which the strong mind simply transcends the conditions that break others. That is not what it means, and the accurate understanding is more practically significant than the inflated version. Genuine difficulty is still difficult for the strong mind. Genuine loss is still loss. Genuine failure still requires the honest acknowledgement of what went wrong. The strong mind is not insulated from the actual weight of real conditions. What it has that the weak mind does not is the capacity to be in those conditions without being defined by them, to experience the difficulty without concluding that it is total, to process the failure without concluding that it is permanent, to navigate genuine adversity without losing the stable foundation of the self that the adversity is testing. Breaking, in the sense the chapter title means, is the specific psychological event in which a difficult external condition produces a lasting internal damage, a persistent degradation of the capacity for clear thinking, stable functioning, and genuine deliberate response. The strong mind does not break in this sense, not because conditions are less severe, but because the internal architecture has been built to withstand and process the conditions that severe difficulty produces without the sustained collapse that weaker architecture experiences. Stability under pressure is the most immediately visible dimension of the mentally unbreakable person, and it is the product of all 10 chapters of this audiobook working as an integrated system. The pause that interrupts the automatic reaction from Chapter 1 prevents the reactive damage that compounds and deepens difficulty. The emotional awareness from Chapter 2 keeps the internal state visible and manageable rather than covertly directing behavior. The trained neural pathways from Chapter 3 make the disciplined responses more automatic and less risk-consuming. The broken weak patterns from Chapter 4 remove the specific recurring failure modes that previously produced the most consistent damage. The resistance to social pressure from Chapter 5 keeps the self-connect stable under social testing. The independent thinking from Chapter 6 prevents the cognitive contamination of groupthink and external direction. The discomfort tolerance from Chapter 7 allows genuine difficulty to be engaged rather than avoided. The psychological armor from Chapter 8 prevents the manipulation and destabilization that external agents can otherwise produce. And the calm mindset from Chapter 9 keeps the deliberate processing available under the full range of conditions that pressure would otherwise degrade it. These capacities together do not produce an easy life. They produce a life that can be genuinely navigated, in which the difficulties that arrive can be processed effectively. The setbacks can be learned from rather than simply survived, and the sustained adversity can be endured without the collapse of the internal architecture that would make recovery impossible. Consistency of character is the dimension of mental strength that is most telling over time, not the performance in the high-stakes moments that anyone can briefly exceed their normal capacity for, but the stable expression of the disciplined mind across the full range of ordinary conditions. Consistency is built through the same process as all the capacities in this audiobook, through the consistent application of the practices in ordinary situations, building the neural pathways and habits that make the disciplined response the default rather than the achievement. The person who has built consistency of character behaves largely the same whether they are observed or unobserved. Whether they are being tested or simply living, whether the stakes are high or ordinary, their psychological discipline is not a performance for specific situations, it is the natural expression of how they actually function. This consistency is recognizable to others, and it produces a specific form of trust, the trust that comes from predictability of character rather than from predictability of behavior. Not that you know in advance exactly what this person will do in any given situation, but that you know the values, the discipline, and the character that will be expressed in whatever they do. This predictability of character, as opposed to predictability of behavior, is the form of reliability that the deepest trust is built from. Long-term mental strength is the cumulative expression of everything this audiobook has built, not the result of a single practice or a single period of effort, but the ongoing output of the consistent application of all the practices described across the ordinary days that constitute a life. Long-term means that the strength is available not just today, in the motivated state of having just completed this audiobook, but in the months and years ahead, in the conditions that test it, the periods that strain it, the days when the practice feels unrewarding and the temptation to return to the default is strong. The strength that persists through these periods is not the strength of continuous motivation. It is the strength of built capacity of neural pathways and habits that have been sufficiently established that they run at lower conscious cost, that have become more the default expression of the person than a deliberate departure from it. The person who has built this long-term strength is not immune to difficulty. They are capable of it, not occasionally in the exceptional moments when the stakes are clear enough to summon the full resource. Consistently, as the characteristic expression of a mind that has been genuinely trained. The training continues in every ordinary moment that follows this one. Every pause taken when the reaction was ready. Every moment of genuine emotional awareness. Every practiced return to the calm baseline when the activation had pulled away from it. Every instance of staying in the discomfort rather than exiting it. This is what the strong mind is made of. Closing. The mind you have built. 10 chapters, 1 complete architecture of psychological discipline. Not a set of disconnected tips for managing specific difficult situations, but an integrated system of mental capacities that together produce the fundamental shift this audiobook promised at the outset from the mind that reacts, that is governed by its automatic patterns, that is shaped primarily by the conditions it moves through to the mind that responds, that governs its own patterns, that shapes its responses to conditions rather than being shaped by them. Chapter 1 named the mechanism at the center of everything, the automatic reaction, and the specific cognitive and social reasons it dominates most people's behavior. The speed of the emotional system versus the deliberateness of the reasoning one. The illusion of feeling right that makes reactive behavior self-perpetuating. The rarity of disciplined thinking, not because it is inaccessible, but because no one teaches the gap it lives in, and no one trains the capacity to inhabit it. Chapter 2 built the foundational practice emotional awareness, developed progressively from post-ho recognition through concurrent recognition to the anticipatory recognition that catches the activation at its earliest signal. The understanding of how emotions distort perception not by fabricating information, but by making some information more vivid and some less accessible in the specific direction each emotional state points, and the trigger mapping practice that makes the personal emotional landscape visible enough to navigate deliberately. Chapter 3 established the framework for all of the capacity building, the mental training model, built on neuroplasticity and habit formation, with the physical training timeline that sets accurate expectations for when to look for results. The critical insight that the absence of immediate visible change in the early training period is not evidence that the training is not working, it is the expected early phase of genuine capacity development. Chapter 4 addressed the specific patterns that need to be broken before the disciplined alternatives can be built, automatic reactions through the recognition interruption replacement sequence, thought loops through the cation or accept decision that cuts them off, and destructive thinking patterns through the deliberate cultivation of accurate alternatives that handle the same situations better. Chapter 5 and Chapter 6 together built the intellectual independence that protects the strong mind from both the internal pressure of approval seeking and the external pressure of conformity, the fear of judgment and its specific cognitive effects, the conformity mechanisms that operate below the threshold of deliberate awareness, the specific practices of pre-commitment, Stillman reasoning, and the honest distinction between genuine persuasion and capitulation to social force. Chapter 7 built the tolerance for the discomfort that all genuine development requires. The mechanism of growth through discomfort, the specific way that capability develops through the repeated engagement with conditions that challenge it. Emotional resilience as the capacity to maintain functional access to deliberate thinking while the emotional discomfort is present. And the progressive tolerance training that builds the endurance for difficulty across the ordinary small discomforts before the large ones demand it. Chapter 8 built the psychological armor, the mental boundaries that distinguish internal processing from external direction. The emotional resilience that maintains stability when the environment is designed to destabilize. And the specific detachment from manipulation that keeps the emotional system from being used as the lever for others' direction of your behavior. Chapter 9 completed the internal architecture with the calm mindset, calm perception as the product of the regulated state. Emotional neutrality as the specific orientation that keeps feeling as information rather than instruction. And strategic thinking as what becomes available when the emotional noise has been reduced enough for the actual deliberate processing capacity to operate. And Chapter 10 named the destination the mentally unbreakable person, not the invulnerable one, but the one whose internal architecture has been built sufficiently to process the genuine difficulty of a genuine life without the collapse that weaker architecture produces. Stability under pressure, consistency of character, long-term strength that is available in the ordinary days as well as in the exceptional ones. The mind described across these 10 chapters is not a fantasy. It is a trained product. It is the output of specific practices applied consistently across sufficient time and sufficient situations to build the genuine capacity rather than simply the intention of it. The intention does nothing. The practice builds everything. And the practice happens in the ordinary moments, not in the dramatic situations where the need is most obvious, but in the daily interactions, the small frustrations, the mild discomforts, the routine situations that either reinforce the old default or build the new one depending on what you choose in them. You have the map now. The territory is every day that follows. Each moment of pause instead of reaction is building something. Each moment of awareness instead of automatic execution is building something. Each moment of staying in the discomfort rather than exiting it is building something. The weak mind reacts. You don't do that anymore. You think first.